The summer heat in Georgia's Savannah River Valley pressed down like a weighted blanket in July of 1842. The plantation house of Elmwood Estate stood as a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering. A grand two-story colonial mansion with white columns that gleamed under the merciless sun. Inside those walls lived Maxwell Thornton, a third-generation plantation owner whose reputation extended throughout Chatham County and beyond. At 55, Thornton maintained the appearance of Southern gentility, immaculately dressed in fine linen suits, his silver hair neatly combed, his voice cultured and deliberate when speaking to his peers. Behind this facade of refinement lurked a calculated cruelty that few white neighbors acknowledged, though all his enslaved people understood intimately. "Mr. Thornton expects you in his study, Miss Eleanor," said Hattie, an enslaved woman of 35 who had served as house manager for nearly 20 years. Her eyes remained downcast as she delivered the message to Eleanor Thornton, the plantation owner's 19-year-old daughter. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her pale blue dress. "Thank you, Hattie. I'll go right away." The relationship between Eleanor and Hattie was complex. Bound by the brutal institution of slavery, yet carrying fragments of genuine human connection. Hattie had practically raised Eleanor after her mother died, giving birth to her younger sister, Constance. That same institution prevented Hattie from protecting Eleanor from what awaited her in her father's study. Maxwell Thornton sat behind a mahogany desk, ledger books open before him. He didn't look up when Eleanor entered. "You requested to see me, Father?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "Yes," Thornton replied, finally raising his eyes to meet hers. "Close the door." The study was oppressively warm despite tall windows that stood open to catch any errant breeze. Portraits of Thornton ancestors stared down from dark-paneled walls, generations of men who had built their fortune on cotton and human bondage. "I've made a decision about your future," Thornton stated flatly. "You'll not be marrying young Mr. Hamilton." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "But Father, we've been courting for nearly a year. I thought you approved of James." "His father's investments have failed. The Hamiltons are nearly bankrupt." Thornton closed his ledger with finality. "You'll remain here at Elmwood. What of Constance? Will she be permitted to marry?" Eleanor asked, thinking of her 17-year-old sister. "She too will remain at Elmwood. This plantation represents generations of Thornton wealth. I won't see it divided or diminished through marriage to families without proper resources." Eleanor's confusion must have shown on her face, for Thornton continued with cold precision. "The Thornton line must continue, Eleanor, and it must remain undiluted by inferior bloodlines." The implications of his statement didn't immediately register. "I don't understand, Father." "You will," he replied. "In time." Outside the window, field hands worked beneath the punishing sun, harvesting cotton that would make its way to the textile mills of New England and England. Among them was Isaiah, a 20-year-old man who had caught Eleanor's eye more than once. His shoulders, broad and strong from years of forced labor, moved rhythmically as he worked. Isaiah's mother had been sold away when he was 12, a punishment for his father's attempted escape. That evening, as darkness fell across the plantation, Hattie helped Eleanor prepare for bed. "What did your father want?" Hattie asked, her voice low, even though they were alone. Eleanor shook her head. "He said, I cannot marry James, that I must remain at Elmwood. Constance, too." Hattie's hands stilled as she brushed Eleanor's hair. Their eyes met in the mirror, and Eleanor saw something like terror flash across the older woman's face. "What is it, Hattie? What aren't you telling me?" Hattie resumed brushing. "Nothing, Miss Eleanor. It's not my place." Later that night, Eleanor was awakened by muffled sounds from down the hall, from her father's bedroom. She recognized Constance's voice, pleading, then sobbing. Eleanor froze in her bed, heart racing. She wanted to go to her sister but found herself paralyzed by fear and confusion. In the slave quarters behind the main house, Isaiah sat with his father, Jacob, an elderly man who had survived 40 years of enslavement at Elmwood. "Something's happening in the big house," Jacob whispered. "Mr. Thornton's been meeting with lawyers from Savannah, talking about some kind of estate doctrine." "What does it mean?" Isaiah asked. "Don't know for certain. But Mr. Parker's enslaved cook overheard things when the lawyers visited." Jacob leaned closer to his son. "They say he's planning to increase his property, not by buying more people, but by breeding them." Isaiah's face hardened. "That's nothing new on plantations." "This is different," Jacob replied, his voice dropping even lower. "They say he plans to use his own daughters." The horror of this revelation hung in the air between them. Isaiah shook his head in disbelief. No white man would do that to his own blood. Wouldn't he? Jacob's eyes reflected decades of witnessing human depravity. To men like Thornton, it's all about property and bloodlines. He sees his daughters as vessels for creating more valuable property. The next morning, Constance did not appear for breakfast. When Eleanor inquired after her, their father merely stated that Constance wasn't feeling well and would remain in her room. Eleanor went to her sister's room after breakfast, knocking softly. "Constance, may I come in?" There was no answer, but Eleanor entered anyway. She found Constance sitting motionless by the window, staring out at the fields. When she turned to face Eleanor, her eyes were vacant, her face pale. "What happened?" Eleanor whispered, rushing to her sister's side. "What did he do to you?" Constance didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "He told me about the estate doctrine. It's what he calls his plan." Her voice sounded distant, detached. "We are to bear children for him, Eleanor, children who will become slaves." Eleanor recoiled in horror. "That's impossible. We're his daughters, and our children would be free. They would have his blood." "Not if he doesn't acknowledge them as his," Constance replied flatly. "Under law, children follow the condition of the mother only when the father doesn't claim them. He's found a way to make it legal, to document them as born to enslaved women." Eleanor felt the room spinning around her. "This can't be happening. It's monstrous." "It's already begun," Constance whispered, tears finally breaking through her shock. "With me." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor watched in growing terror as her father's plan unfolded. Constance remained isolated, emerging only for evening meals where she barely spoke. Thornton conducted his business as usual, hosting neighboring plantation owners, attending church on Sundays, maintaining every appearance of respectability. Meanwhile, Isaiah had shared what he learned with others in the slave quarters. The information moved silently through the community of enslaved people, adding new horror to their already unbearable existence. One evening, as Eleanor walked the grounds in the fading light, she found herself near the oak tree where Hattie sometimes went to be alone. Hattie sat with her back against the massive trunk, eyes closed. "Miss Eleanor," Hattie said without opening her eyes, "you shouldn't be out here alone." "I needed air," Eleanor replied, sitting beside the woman who had been the closest thing to a mother she'd known. "Hattie, did you know about my father's plans?" Hattie was silent for a long moment. "I suspected. There have been rumors among the house staff. When he started meeting with those lawyers from Savannah, it's called the estate doctrine," Eleanor said bitterly. "He's going to force us to bear children that he will then enslave, his own grandchildren." Hattie finally opened her eyes, turning to look directly at Eleanor. "Not if you get away from here." Eleanor stared at her. "Escape? Where would I go? How would I live? There are people who help, the Underground Railroad. That's for enslaved people," Eleanor interrupted. "And what do you think you are now?" Hattie asked sharply. "You think because your skin is white and you sleep in the big house that you're free. Your father owns you just as surely as he owns me." The truth of these words struck Eleanor with physical force. She had always seen herself as separate from the enslaved people on the plantation, sympathetic to their suffering perhaps, but fundamentally different. Now she realized that in her father's eyes she was merely property with a specific purpose. "Constance," Eleanor whispered. "We would need to take her too." Hattie nodded. And it would have to be soon, before— She didn't finish the sentence. Before she's with child. Eleanor completed the thought. The words tasted like poison on her tongue. As they sat beneath the oak tree, planning in hushed voices, neither noticed Isaiah working nearby, close enough to overhear fragments of their conversation. Later that night, as Eleanor lay awake in her bed, a soft knock came at her bedroom door. When she opened it, Isaiah stood in the darkened hallway, his presence in the main house after dark, a capital offense. "You need to leave tomorrow night," he whispered, without preamble. "There's a man coming to guide you north. I've sent word." Eleanor stared at him, speechless at the risk he was taking. "Why would you help me?" Isaiah's eyes held hers steadily. "Because what your father plans is an abomination, and because no one deserves to be enslaved. Not you, not your sister, not the children he would force you to bear." In that moment, standing in the dark hallway of her father's house, Eleanor Thornton began to understand the true meaning of freedom and the desperate courage of those who reached for it despite impossible odds. The day of escape arrived with suffocating humidity that pressed down on Elmwood Plantation like a premonition. Eleanor moved through her normal routines with mechanical precision, terror and anticipation battling within her chest. At breakfast, her father discussed crop yields and cotton prices, while Constance stared vacantly at her untouched plate. If Maxwell Thornton noticed his younger daughter's withdrawal, he gave no indication. "I'll be riding to Savannah today on business," he announced as he folded his napkin. "I expect to return tomorrow afternoon." Eleanor's eyes briefly met Hattie's as the older woman cleared dishes from the table. This unexpected development seemed providential. Their planned escape would coincide with Thornton's absence. "Yes, father," Eleanor replied, struggling to keep her voice even. "Will you be staying with the Hargroves?" "No, I have matters to attend to with Judge Preston regarding our estate planning." He looked directly at Constance as he spoke, and Eleanor saw her sister flinch visibly. After her father departed, Eleanor sought out Constance in the garden where she sat beneath a magnolia tree, listlessly embroidering a handkerchief. "We're leaving tonight," Eleanor whispered, taking her sister's cold hands in her own. Constance's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Leaving? How? Where would we go?" "North. There are people who will help us." Eleanor squeezed her sister's hands. "But we must prepare carefully. Pack only what you can carry in a small bundle, one dress, undergarments, perhaps a memento, nothing more." "Father will find us," Constance said, her voice hollow with defeat. "He'll never let us go. He won't find us." Eleanor tried to project confidence she didn't fully feel. "Many have escaped before us and found freedom. Those were Negro slaves, not the daughters of plantation owners," Constance argued, tears forming in her eyes. "Where would we belong? How would we live?" Eleanor had asked herself these same questions repeatedly. "We will find work, teaching perhaps, or as seamstresses. We'll create new lives far from here." As dusk approached, Isaiah met Eleanor behind the kitchen garden, his voice urgent. "There's a problem. Overseer Collins is suspicious. He's ordered extra patrols tonight around the plantation boundaries." Eleanor felt her carefully constructed plan crumbling. "Can we wait until tomorrow?" Isaiah shook his head. "The man who's to guide you can't wait, and your father returns tomorrow." He paused, thinking. "There's another way, but it's more dangerous, through the swamp." Mai, the Okefenokee Swamp, was a treacherous maze of water and wilderness that bordered parts of the plantation's extensive lands. Local legends told of runaway slaves who had disappeared into its depths, never to be seen again. "We'll do it," Eleanor decided. "What time?" "Midnight. Meet at the old cypress at the edge of the north field. Bring only what you can carry without being slowed down." As Isaiah turned to leave, Eleanor caught his arm. "Why are you risking so much for us?" His eyes met hers with unexpected intensity. "Because what your father plans violates even God's laws, and because freedom should belong to everyone, not just those born with white skin. The words hung between them, acknowledging the vast gulf of experience that separated them despite their shared humanity. Then Isaiah disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Eleanor to complete preparations for the most dangerous night of her life. In the hours before midnight, Eleanor helped Constance prepare, binding her sister's long hair beneath a cap and dressing her in the plainest clothes they could find. They each packed a small bundle with an extra dress, undergarments, and a few personal items. Eleanor included the miniature portrait of her mother that she kept by her bedside, the only connection to a parent who might have protected them had she lived. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 11, Eleanor and Constance slipped downstairs. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. They moved toward the kitchen door, which would provide the least visible exit from the main house. They had nearly reached it when a voice spoke from the shadows. "I knew you'd try to run." Maxwell Thornton stepped into view, a pistol held casually at his side. He had not gone to Savannah after all. It had been a trap to expose their plans. "Father," Eleanor gasped, instinctively stepping in front of Constance, "you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted, his voice cold with fury. "You would abandon your heritage, your place, your duty to this family." He gestured with the pistol. "Return to your rooms. We will discuss your punishment in the morning." Eleanor felt Constance trembling behind her. "We won't stay so you can use us as breeding stock," she said, finding courage in desperation. "What you plan is monstrous." "What I plan ensures the future of this plantation," Thornton replied. "The estate doctrine is perfectly legal, a system by which the Thornton bloodline and property can multiply without dilution or division." He stepped closer. "Your children will be born to carefully selected house servants on paper only. They will carry our superior blood, but remain our property." "They would be your grandchildren," Eleanor whispered in horror. "They will be valuable assets," Thornton corrected her. "Light-skinned slaves bring premium prices in New Orleans. Or they can remain here, working our lands, increasing our fortune with every generation." The calculated evil of her father's plan struck Eleanor with new force. This wasn't just about increasing his property holdings, it was about creating a self-perpetuating system that would extend his control beyond his lifetime. "Now," Thornton continued, "back to your rooms. Isaiah will be dealt with tonight." Eleanor felt her blood turn cold. "Isaiah, what does he have to do with this?" A cruel smile touched Thornton's lips. "Did you think I wouldn't discover your conspirator? Overseer Collins observed your meeting this afternoon." He raised his voice. "Collins!" The front door opened and the overseer entered, dragging a battered and bloodied Isaiah with him. The young man's face was nearly unrecognizable from beating, but his eyes found Eleanor's, communicating a silent message she couldn't fully comprehend. "Take him to the whipping post," Thornton ordered. 30 lashes now, 30 more at dawn. Make sure everyone watches." "No!" The cry escaped Eleanor before she could stop it. "He did nothing. This was my idea." "Then you've caused his suffering," her father replied without emotion. "Perhaps that will teach you the consequences of defiance." As Collins dragged Isaiah away, Thornton gestured with his pistol toward the stairs. "To your rooms. I'll post men at your doors tonight." Eleanor and Constance had no choice but to comply, returning to their gilded prison with the sounds of Isaiah's punishment beginning to echo across the plantation grounds. The crack of the whip, followed by muffled groans that Isaiah tried to suppress, filtered through the closed windows of Eleanor's bedroom. She pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. "We've failed," she whispered, "and Isaiah suffers for our attempt." Hours later, a soft scratching at her door roused Eleanor from restless half-sleep. She opened it to find Hattie, her face set with determination. "The guard fell asleep," Hattie whispered. "You must go now, through the servants' stairs at the back of the house." "We can't," Eleanor replied brokenly. "Isaiah is alive," Hattie finished. "Barely. But he made me promise to get you out tonight. The guide still waits at the cypress." "What about you?" Eleanor asked, suddenly realizing what would happen to Hattie if her role in their escape was discovered. "Don't worry about me," Hattie replied. "Just go." Eleanor quickly roused Constance from the adjacent bedroom. Together, they followed Hattie through the darkened house, moving silently past the sleeping guard posted in the hallway. The servants' staircase led down to a narrow door that opened behind a stand of hydrangeas at the side of the house. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of cicadas and frogs. A three-quarter moon cast enough light to see by, but also exposed them to potential discovery. They moved quickly across the lawn toward the shelter of oak trees that would lead them to the north field. "We need to hurry," Hattie urged in a whisper. "The change of guard happens at 4 o'clock." They had nearly reached the tree line when a shout came from behind them. One of the field patrollers had spotted their movement. Within seconds, lanterns were being lit at the slave quarters, and men were emerging from the overseer's cabin. "Run!" Hattie pushed Eleanor and Constance toward the trees. "Don't stop until you reach the cypress." Eleanor grabbed Constance's hand, and they fled into the darkness, terror giving them speed they didn't know they possessed. Behind them, they could hear Hattie creating a diversion, calling out that she had seen someone near the kitchen garden, directing attention away from their actual escape route. The woods were disorienting at night, branches whipping at their faces as they ran blindly toward where they hoped the cypress tree stood. The sounds of pursuit grew behind them, men with dogs now, their barking cutting through the night air with menacing clarity. "I can't," Constance gasped, stumbling. "I can't run anymore." "You must." Eleanor dragged her sister forward. "We're almost there." They broke through the trees into the north field, the massive cypress visible as a darker shadow against the night sky. A figure detached itself from the trunk as they approached, a tall black man they had never seen before. "You the Thornton girls?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, struggling to catch her breath. "Yes, they're coming. They have dogs." "Then we take to the water," the man replied. "I'm Moses. Follow me and do exactly as I say." He led them past the cypress toward where the solid ground gave way to the beginning of the swamp. The earth became increasingly soggy beneath their feet, the smell of rotting vegetation and stagnant water growing stronger. "Step where I step," Moses instructed. "There's quicksand and sinkholes all through here." The sounds of pursuit continued behind them, but the dogs seemed confused now that the trail led into water. Moses guided them along what appeared to be an invisible path through deepening water and cypress knees. Eventually, they reached a small, flat-bottomed boat concealed among cattails. "Get in," Moses directed. "Lie flat and don't move." Eleanor helped Constance into the boat, then climbed in herself, both of them lying on their backs and staring up at the star-filled sky. Moses used a long pole to push them deeper into the swamp, navigating channels that seemed indistinguishable from the surrounding waters. The voices of their pursuers grew fainter as the swamp enveloped them in its protective labyrinth. But even as physical distance increased between them and Elmwood Plantation, Eleanor could not escape the mental image of Isaiah bleeding at the whipping post, or Hattie deliberately drawing attention to herself to facilitate their escape. "They'll kill them," she whispered to the night sky. "Because of us." Moses's voice came quietly from where he stood at the rear of the boat. "Maybe, or maybe not. Your father values property too much to destroy it without reason. Isaiah helped us plan our escape," Eleanor said. "And Hattie can deny everything," Moses interrupted. "And your father won't want to damage his reputation by acknowledging why you fled. That might raise questions he doesn't want to answer." The boat continued its silent journey through the night, bearing two young white women into an uncertain future, fugitives from a system that had claimed ownership of their bodies and reproductive capacity, just as it had claimed ownership of the bodies and labor of those they left behind. As dawn broke over the swamp, painting the misty waters with pale golden light, Eleanor realized they had crossed an invisible boundary. They were no longer the privileged daughters of Maxwell Thornton. They were merely human beings seeking freedom, their fate now tied to the courage and compassion of those whom society had deemed less than human, but who embodied humanity's highest principles. And back at Elmwood, in the slave quarters where Isaiah lay barely conscious from his beating, Jacob tended his son's wounds with herbal poultices, whispering, "They got away, son. The Thornton girls escaped. Your suffering bought their freedom." A faint smile crossed Isaiah's swollen lips. "Worth it," he managed to whisper. "Freedom, worth any price." Oh! By the third day of their journey, Eleanor and Constance Thornton had transformed beyond recognition. Their fine hands were blistered from rowing when water routes permitted, their faces sunburned from exposure, their once immaculate clothing stained with mud and sweat. They moved through Georgia's backcountry following Moses, who navigated using stars and barely visible landmarks, avoiding roads and settlements where possible. "How much farther?" Constance asked during a brief rest. Her voice had lost its cultured southern lilt, replaced by the flat tone of exhaustion. "To freedom, hundreds of miles yet," Moses replied. "But to the next safe house, less than a day's journey." The concept of safe houses, homes of abolitionists who risked their lives and freedom to harbor fugitives, was still new to the sisters. They had grown up believing that the entire North existed in unified opposition to slavery, only to learn from Moses that danger lurked everywhere, even in free states where slave catchers operated with near impunity under the Fugitive Slave Act. "Your case is unusual," Moses explained as they prepared to resume their journey. "Most stations on the railroad aren't accustomed to handling white fugitives, but your father's plans have created a special circumstance." Eleanor nodded grimly. "We're property now, just like any enslaved person." Moses gave her a long look. "You were always property, Miss Eleanor. The law just hadn't reminded you of it yet." That evening they reached a small farm, nestled in a clearing among pine forests. A single lantern burned in the window, the signal Moses had been looking for. The farmer, a weathered man named Samuel Cooper, welcomed them with cautious hospitality. "You can rest in the root cellar tonight," he informed them after a simple meal of cornbread and beans. "Tomorrow my wife will help you prepare for the next stage." "Prepare how?" Eleanor asked. Cooper exchanged glances with Moses. "You need to change your appearance. You're too recognizable as you are." The following morning, Cooper's wife Martha helped the sisters transform themselves. Their long hair was cut short, their dresses exchanged for rough boys' clothing. When Eleanor looked at her reflection in a small hand mirror, a stranger stared back, a youth with cropped hair and sunburned features that could pass for a farm boy. "From now on, you're Eli and Charlie Wilson, orphan brothers traveling north to live with an uncle in Pennsylvania," Martha instructed them. "Practice speaking like boys, walking like boys. Your lives depend on it." While they prepared, Samuel Cooper returned from town with a newspaper. He handed it to Moses with a grim expression. "Thornton's offering $5,000 for their return. Claims they were kidnapped by an abolitionist conspiracy." Eleanor took the paper with trembling hands. There on the front page was an engraving of her and Constance, alongside a detailed description. Below was another image, Isaiah hanging from the old oak tree at Elmwood, his body left on display as a warning. "No," Eleanor whispered, the paper falling from her nerveless fingers. "No, it can't be." Moses picked up the fallen paper, his face impassive but his eyes reflecting deep sorrow. He was a brave man. He knew the risk. Constance began to sob quietly. "He died because of us. He died because of Maxwell Thornton and the evil system he represents," Cooper corrected sharply. "Don't diminish Isaiah's sacrifice by claiming responsibility that isn't yours." Eleanor's grief was quickly hardening into something else, a cold fury that burned away her remaining attachment to her old life. "What about Hattie? Does it say what happened to her?" Moses scanned the article. "No mention. That might be good news if she succeeded in deflecting suspicion." That night, Unable to sleep in the cramped root cellar that sheltered them, Eleanor whispered to Constance, "We need to learn to defend ourselves. We can't keep depending on others to risk everything for us." Constance's voice came back through the darkness, stronger than Eleanor had heard it in weeks. "Yes, and someday we'll find a way to fight back against Father, not just for ourselves, but for Isaiah and all the others at Elmwood." The journey northward continued in stages, traveling by night, hiding by day, moving from one safe house to another. Sometimes they traveled in the false bottom of a wagon beneath sacks of grain. Other times they walked for miles through forests and fields, guided by the North Star and the coded instructions passed through the Underground Railroad network. Their disguise as orphaned brothers proved effective, though they had several close calls. Once, while waiting at a rural crossroads for their next guide, a patrol of slave catchers rode past. The leader of the group, a man with cold eyes and a scarred face, looked directly at them, but saw only two unremarkable farm boys sharing a loaf of bread. That was Harker, their next guide, a Quaker man named Micah told them later. "He's captured more than 50 fugitives in the past year. They say he can smell fear." "We weren't afraid," Eleanor replied, though her heart had been pounding so hard she was certain it would betray them. "We were angry." In Western Virginia, they stayed for 3 days with a family of free blacks who operated a small inn that served as a crucial link in the Underground Railroad. The matriarch, a formidable woman named Ruth, who had purchased her own freedom 20 years earlier, took a special interest in the sisters. "You think you understand what it means to be property now," she told Eleanor as they helped prepare dinner. "But you've had just a taste of it. Those you left behind have lived it their entire lives." Eleanor nodded soberly. "I know. We were blind to it, even though it happened right before our eyes every day." Ruth gave her a penetrating look. "And what will you do with your eyes now that they're open?" It was a question Eleanor had been asking herself with increasing frequency. What responsibility did they bear, having escaped while others remained in bondage? What obligation did their newfound understanding place upon them? One afternoon, while waiting for arrangements for the next leg of their journey, Ruth taught them to shoot using an old flintlock pistol. "Center mass," she instructed as Eleanor aimed at a makeshift target. "Don't try for fancy shots. Just stop whoever's trying to take your freedom." The pistol's recoil was stronger than Eleanor expected, the ball going wide of the target. She grimaced in frustration. "Again," Ruth said calmly, "freedom requires persistence." By the time they left Ruth's inn, both sisters could hit the target consistently. Ruth gifted them the pistol and a small pouch of ammunition before they departed. "I pray you never need to use it," she said. "But if you do, don't hesitate." Their journey continued through Pennsylvania, each day taking them farther from the immediate threat of recapture, but not from the psychological shadow of Elmwood. Eleanor frequently woke from nightmares in which Isaiah called her name as he dangled from the oak tree, or in which her father pursued her through endless swamps. "Do you think we'll ever truly escape him?" Constance asked one evening as they rested in a barn loft, awaiting their next guide. Eleanor considered the question carefully. His physical reach, yes, eventually. But what he represents? She shook her head. That evil is everywhere, even in the North, where they claim to oppose slavery, yet profit from it through their mills and shipping. Then what hope is there? Constance's voice trembled with exhaustion and despair. "The hope is in people like Moses and Samuel Cooper and Ruth," Eleanor replied. "People who recognize evil and stand against it, whatever the cost." She took her sister's hand. "And now that must include us." Near the Pennsylvania-New York border, disaster struck. Their guide, a young Quaker man barely older than Eleanor, led them into a trap. Whether he betrayed them deliberately or was himself deceived remained unclear. But the result was the same. They found themselves surrounded by armed men led by the scarred slave-catcher Harker. "Well, well," Harker drawled, recognition dawning in his eyes as he looked at them more carefully. "The Thornton girls, playing at being boys. Your father will be mighty pleased to see you home." Eleanor's hand moved slowly toward the pistol concealed beneath her loose shirt. Constance, sensing her sister's intention, began to speak, drawing Harker's attention. "Our father is a monster," Constance declared. "He plans to use us as breeding stock to increase his property." Harker laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "That's none of my concern, miss. I'm just here for the $5,000. "And how much is your life worth?" Eleanor asked quietly, the pistol now in her hand, aimed steadily at Harker's chest. "Because I promise you, we won't be taken back alive." The certainty in her voice caused Harker to hesitate. He had expected hysterical young women, not this deadly calm determination. His men exchanged uncertain glances, the easy capture they'd anticipated suddenly complicated by the pistol in Eleanor's unwavering hand. "Now step back," Eleanor continued. "All of you, we're leaving." "You won't shoot," Harker challenged, though with less confidence than before. "Fine ladies like you don't have the stomach for killing." "We're not fine ladies anymore," Eleanor replied. "Your system took that from us, just as it takes humanity from everyone it touches." She cocked the hammer of the pistol. "Last warning. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed, if not for the sudden arrival of a wagon driven at dangerous speed, Ruth herself handling the reins with expert precision. It crashed through the circle of men, creating momentary chaos that Eleanor and Constance used to break free, running toward the wagon as Ruth brought it to a halt. "Get in!" Ruth shouted. They scrambled onto the wagon as shots rang out behind them. Eleanor turned, raised Ruth's pistol, and fired. Harker cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. Then they were racing away, the wagon bouncing violently over the rutted road as Ruth urged the horses to their limits. "How did you find us?" Eleanor gasped when they had put enough distance behind them to slow to a safer pace. "Word came that Harker was moving north with unusual confidence," Ruth explained. "I suspected a betrayal." "The Quaker boy?" Constance asked. Ruth nodded grimly. "Found him this morning. 30 pieces of silver in his pocket and a bullet in his head. Harker doesn't leave witnesses to his transactions." The brutal reality of their situation settled over them anew. There would be no easy escape, no moment when they could relax their vigilance. The tentacles of the slave system reached far and corrupted deeply. That night, hiding in a cave while Ruth went to arrange new transportation, Eleanor and Constance held each other close for warmth and comfort. "I shot a man today," Eleanor whispered, the reality of her action finally penetrating the protective numbness of crisis. "I might have killed him." "You protected us," Constance reassured her, "just as Isaiah protected us, and Hattie and Ruth. That's what people do when faced with great evil. They resist." As dawn broke, Ruth returned with fresh horses and news. "Harker lives, but his reputation is shattered. A notorious slave catcher brought down by a girl with a single shot." There was grim satisfaction in her voice. "The story's spreading already. It gives hope to others fleeing northward." Eleanor hadn't considered that their resistance might have significance beyond their personal survival. The thought that their actions could inspire others carried both power and responsibility. "Where do we go now?" she asked. "Canada," Ruth replied definitively. "After what happened with Harker, nowhere in the United States is safe for you. Your father's influence reaches too far." As they prepared to resume their journey, now with an even more distant destination, Eleanor looked southward one last time. Somewhere in that direction lay Elmwood Plantation, with its grand house and hidden horrors. Somewhere there, her father still implemented his estate doctrine, perhaps now with other young women acquired for the purpose. "We'll come back someday," she vowed silently. "Not as Maxwell Thornton's daughters, but as witnesses to his crimes, and the world will know the truth of the Georgia Patriarch." Toronto, in the autumn of 1843, presented a stark contrast to the Georgia plantation Eleanor and Constance had fled. Cool winds swept across Lake Ontario, carrying the promise of early snow as the sisters settled into their new life in a small, rented room above a bookshop owned by an elderly abolitionist named Frederick Hammond. "You'll need to establish new identities," Hammond advised during their first week in the city. "The Thornton name is too dangerous to keep, even here in Canada." Eleanor nodded, having anticipated this necessity. "We'll be Eleanor and Constance Freeman," she decided, the surname a deliberate choice that acknowledged their journey. Hammond had arranged positions for them, Eleanor as an assistant in his bookshop, Constance as a seamstress with a local dressmaker. The work was exhausting in its own way, but fundamentally different from the privileged idleness of their previous lives. Here, their labor belonged to themselves. "Have you given any thought to what comes next?" Hammond asked Eleanor one evening as they closed the shop. "Beyond mere survival, I mean." Eleanor paused in her task of shelving returned books. "Truthfully, I've been focused on ensuring Constance recovers her spirits. The journey was particularly hard on her." Hammond's kind eyes studied her thoughtfully. "And you? How do you process what you've experienced?" Eleanor had no ready answer. The trauma of their escape, Isaiah's execution, the constant fear during their northward journey, and the strange mixture of guilt and relief that accompanied their freedom, all of it remained unexamined, carefully contained behind the practical concerns of daily survival. "I write," she finally admitted, "at night when Constance is asleep. I record everything that happened at Elmwood, everything we witnessed and experienced. I don't know why exactly, perhaps so it won't be forgotten. Perhaps because truth demands witness," Hammond suggested. "Would you consider sharing what you've written?" The question startled her. "Share it? With whom?" "There are publications dedicated to the abolitionist cause," Hammond explained. "Personal testimonies like yours, especially from someone who was part of the planter class, could be powerful weapons in the fight against slavery." Eleanor had never considered that her private writings might serve a larger purpose. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of exposure if my father discovered I was publishing such accounts." Hammond nodded in understanding. "Consider it carefully. Such stories can change minds that might otherwise remain closed to moral arguments. But the decision must be yours, made with full awareness of the potential consequences." The seeds of that conversation took root in Eleanor's mind over the following weeks. She continued her nightly writing, but with a new awareness of potential audience beyond herself. The act of documentation transformed from private therapy to something more purposeful, a testimony against the institution that had nearly consumed her and her sister. Meanwhile, Constance had found unexpected purpose in her work at the dressmaker's shop. Her skilled needlework, once merely an accomplishment expected of a Southern lady, became a valuable trade. More significantly, she began teaching basic literacy to the children of other fugitives who had settled in their Toronto neighborhood. "They're so eager to learn," she told Eleanor one evening, her face animated with enthusiasm Eleanor hadn't seen since before their escape. "Mrs. Peterson allows us to use the back room of the shop after hours. Some of the children walk nearly 2 miles to attend." Eleanor smiled, genuinely pleased by her sister's newfound passion. "You always had a gift for teaching. Remember how you helped Hattie's daughter Sarah learn her letters?" The mention of Elmwood brought a momentary shadow to Constance's expression. "Do you think Sarah still has the primer I made for her? Or did Father burn everything associated with us after we fled?" It was the sort of unanswerable question that haunted both sisters, the fate of those left behind, especially Hattie, whose courage had made their escape possible. Had she suffered Isaiah's fate? Or had she successfully maintained her innocence? In December, an unexpected visitor arrived at Hammond's bookshop. Eleanor was arranging a new display of theological texts when the bell above the door jangled and a tall black woman entered, wrapped in a heavy woolen coat against the Canadian winter. "I'm looking for Eleanor Freeman," the woman said, her eyes moving cautiously around the shop as if assessing potential threats. Eleanor stepped forward, instantly alert. Few people knew them by their new surname. "I'm Eleanor Freeman." The woman studied her face intently before reaching into her coat and withdrawing a carefully folded letter. "Ruth sent me to deliver this." I've carried it from Pennsylvania." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the letter. Ruth, the formidable woman who had taught her to shoot, who had rescued them from Harker's trap. "Are you staying in Toronto?" "You must come to dinner." The messenger shook her head. "I leave for Halifax tonight. Better you don't know more than that." She turned to go, then paused. "Ruth said to tell you that your shot changed things. Word spread about a plantation daughter who chose freedom over privilege and put a bullet in Harker. It gives people courage." After the messenger departed, Eleanor closed the shop early and rushed home to their rooms, where she opened Ruth's letter with nervous anticipation. The contents brought both relief and renewed anguish. "My dear friends, I pray this finds you well established in your new life. News reached us through the railroad that you arrived safely in Toronto, though I counsel continued vigilance. Your father's agents still search, offering increased rewards for information. You should know that Hattie lives. Though suspected of aiding your escape, she maintained her innocence convincingly. Your father could ill afford to lose another valuable household servant after the example he made of Isaiah, which brings me to harder news. Before his execution, Isaiah was tortured for information about the railroad's routes and safe houses. He revealed nothing, taking our secrets to his grave. His father Jacob attempted to retrieve his body for proper burial, but was himself whipped nearly to death for the attempt. Conditions at Elmwood have worsened since your departure. Your father's rage manifests in increased cruelty toward those he still controls. More troubling, he has acquired 3 young women from Charleston, orphans of good family but no fortune, ostensibly as companions for his household. Those with eyes to see understand his true purpose. The estate doctrine proceeds despite your escape. I tell you these painful truths not to burden your hearts, but to fuel your resolve. The evil you fled continues unabated. Its roots run deep in Southern society, protected by law and custom. Should you ever wish to strike a blow against this system, know that your testimony would be a powerful weapon. Consider carefully what responsibility your freedom places upon you. With deepest respect, Ruth Eleanor read the letter twice before sharing it with Constance that evening. They sat in silence afterward, the weight of what they had learned settling heavily between them. "He's continuing his plan with other young women," Constance finally said, her voice hollow with horror. "Girls with no family to protect them." Eleanor nodded grimly. "And conditions worsen for those we left behind. We have to do something," Constance insisted, sudden fire in her eyes. "We can't just live our lives here in safety while this continues." Eleanor retrieved a wooden box from beneath her bed, opening it to reveal the manuscript she'd been assembling over the months since their arrival in Toronto. "I've been documenting everything. Hammond believes it could be published in abolitionist papers." Constance took the pages with reverent care, scanning the neat handwriting that detailed the horrors of Elmwood and the estate doctrine. "Yes," she whispered, "the world must know." The decision, once made, brought both terror and relief. Eleanor worked with Hammond to edit her manuscript into a series of articles suitable for publication. They agreed to use a pseudonym, a daughter of the South, though both understood that the specific details would likely reveal her identity to her father regardless. The first installment appeared in March 1844 in the North Star, Frederick Douglass's anti-slavery newspaper. Titled "The Estate Doctrine, a Georgia Planter's Plan to Breed His Own Slaves," it created an immediate sensation. Eleanor's insider perspective, combined with her unflinching descriptions of the moral corruption inherent in the slave system, offered powerful ammunition to the abolitionist cause. Additional publications picked up the series, spreading it throughout the northern states and into Europe. Letters poured into the North Star's offices, some expressing outrage at the horrors described, others dismissing the account as abolitionist fiction. A few plantation owners published rebuttals, claiming that no Southern gentleman would ever contemplate such a scheme, unwittingly amplifying the reach of Eleanor's testimony. In June, Hammond brought worrying news to their rooms above his shop. "Your father has arrived in New York City," he reported gravely. "He's publicly denounced your articles as libelous fabrications and announced his intention to bring you back to Georgia to face charges." Eleanor had been preparing for this moment since the first article's publication. "He has no legal authority here in Canada." "True," Hammond acknowledged, "but he has resources and determination. And not everyone in Toronto opposes slavery or the return of fugitives." He hesitated before adding, "There are rumors he's hired men to abduct you." Constance paled visibly. "Then we must flee again? Further north?" Eleanor shook her head, a calm certainty settling over her. "No, we stop running now. If we disappear, it only serves his purpose. He can claim we fled because our stories were lies." She met Hammond's concerned gaze. "It's time to stand openly and publicly against him." Within days, Eleanor arranged a public lecture at Toronto City Hall, announcing that a daughter of the South would speak about her experiences on a Georgia plantation. Posters around the city advertised the event, intentionally drawing attention that would make a clandestine abduction more difficult. The evening of the lecture, the hall was filled beyond capacity. Abolitionists, curious citizens, and newspaper reporters from both Canadian and American publications crowded the space. Security was provided by a group of free black men organized by Hammond, who recognized the very real danger Eleanor faced. When she took the stage, a hush fell over the audience. Eleanor Thornton Freeman, now 21 years old, stood straight-backed and resolute before the crowd, her appearance transformed from the pampered plantation daughter who had fled Georgia nearly 2 years earlier. Her eyes scanned the audience briefly before she began to speak. "My name is Eleanor Thornton," she stated clearly, deliberately reclaiming her birth name for this moment of public testimony. "Until 2 years ago, I lived on Elmwood Plantation in Chatham County, Georgia, the daughter of Maxwell Thornton. I stand before you today to testify to the moral abomination I witnessed and nearly became victim to, a system that reduces human beings to property and corrupts all it touches, even those who believe themselves its beneficiaries." For the next hour, she detailed the estate doctrine and her father's plans, the courage of Isaiah and Hattie, and the brutal realities of plantation life that Southern hospitality concealed from visitors. She spoke of Ruth and the Underground Railroad, of the network of conscience that extended hands of assistance across racial and class divides. As she neared the conclusion of her speech, a disturbance at the back of the hall caught her attention. Several men were pushing their way through the crowd toward the stage. At their center walked Maxwell Thornton himself, his face twisted with fury. "Liar!" he shouted, pointing at Eleanor. "Ungrateful child, spreading vicious falsehoods about her family." Eleanor did not retreat as her father advanced. Instead, she raised her voice to be heard over the growing commotion. "Is it falsehood, Father? Would you deny under oath the contents of the documents you had prepared by Judge Preston, the legal framework for your estate doctrine? Would his testimony support your denials?" Thornton stopped abruptly, his face draining of color at the mention of specific names and documents. Eleanor pressed her advantage. "Would you deny the purchase of 3 orphaned girls from Charleston? Would you deny the construction of the special cabin behind the main house where you planned to keep your daughters during their confinements?" The hall had gone completely silent, the audience witnessing a confrontation with implications far beyond a family dispute. In that moment, Eleanor embodied the moral challenge that abolitionists presented to the entire slave system. Not just its economic underpinnings, but its fundamental violation of human dignity and familial bonds. "You have no power here," Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "No overseers, no whipping posts, no legal system designed to protect your property rights. Here, your daughter stands as your equal, free to speak truth against your crimes." Maxwell Thornton seemed to physically shrink under the weight of public exposure. The men who had accompanied him looked uncertainly at each other, clearly unprepared for this direct confrontation in a hall filled with hostile witnesses. "This isn't over," Thornton finally managed to growl, his southern gentleman's facade cracking to reveal the brutality beneath. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It won't be over until every person held in bondage walks free. It won't be over until the estate doctrine and all such abominations are consigned to history's darkest chapters. It won't be over until men like you can no longer claim ownership of other human beings or of their own daughters." Thornton retreated from the hall, followed by his hired men, their planned abduction rendered impossible by the public nature of the confrontation. Eleanor watched him go, realizing that she was finally truly free of his power, not just physically beyond his reach, but liberated from the fear that had pursued her since their escape. In the days that followed, newspapers throughout Canada and the northern United States reported on the dramatic confrontation. Maxwell Thornton's reputation suffered irreparable damage as investigations into the estate doctrine gained momentum. Judge Preston, facing scrutiny over his role in creating the legal framework, provided documents that confirmed Eleanor's allegations in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The 3 young women Thornton had acquired were removed from Elmwood by Georgia authorities, though the investigation into his broader treatment of enslaved people proceeded slowly against entrenched resistance from the planter class. 1 month after the Toronto lecture, Eleanor received another letter delivered by the Underground Railroad. This one came not from Ruth, but from Hattie herself. "Miss Eleanor, though I should now say Miss Freeman, word of your brave stand in Toronto has reached even Elmwood." The newspapers published accounts that were read aloud in secret throughout the quarters. "Your father returned from Canada, a broken man, his standing among neighboring planters destroyed. There is talk of selling Elmwood, and all of us with it. Many fear being separated from family members. Others see opportunity in the disruption, planning escapes while your father drowns his humiliation in brandy and the overseers argue among themselves. Isaiah's father Jacob asks me to tell you that his son's sacrifice has borne fruit beyond imagining. Your testimony has accomplished what no runaway's account could. It has exposed the system from within, using the unquestionable voice of the planter class against itself. Whatever comes next for those of us still held at Elmwood, know that you have struck a meaningful blow for justice. The estate doctrine is now public knowledge, its horrors impossible to deny. Other young women will be spared what you and Miss Constance nearly suffered. With eternal gratitude and admiration, Hattie, Eleanor and Constance continued their work in Toronto, Eleanor writing and speaking against slavery, Constance expanding her teaching to include adult literacy classes for fugitives, preparing to build new lives in freedom. They maintained connections with the Underground Railroad, providing assistance to those newly arrived from southern states. The estate doctrine became a powerful symbol in abolitionist literature, representing the moral bankruptcy of a system that corrupted even the most fundamental human relationships. Eleanor's articles were collected and published as a book in 1846, contributing to the growing body of testimony that would eventually help turn Northern public opinion decisively against slavery. Maxwell Thornton never recovered from the public exposure of his plans. Elmwood was indeed sold, though the enslaved community was not kept together as Hattie had feared. Some, including Hattie herself, eventually made their way north via the Underground Railroad, bringing news of others left behind. On a cold December evening in 1850, Eleanor stood at the Toronto waterfront, watching a small boat approach through the gathering darkness. Inside were 3 passengers, Hattie, now in her mid-40s, and 2 younger women Eleanor didn't recognize. As Hattie stepped onto Canadian soil, the women embraced, their shared journey coming full circle. "Welcome to freedom," Eleanor whispered, the words carrying the weight of all they had experienced. Hattie pulled back to look at the young woman she had once cared for as a child. "We brought something for you," she said, reaching into a small bag she carried. What she withdrew was a carefully preserved miniature portrait, the same one of Eleanor's mother that she had carried with her during their escape, but had been forced to abandon during their confrontation with Harker. "Isaiah's father saved it," Hattie explained. "He kept it hidden all these years, knowing someday he'd find a way to return it to you." Eleanor accepted the portrait with trembling hands, the small oval frame containing not just her mother's image, but a physical connection to Elmwood and all they had left behind, both the horror and the unexpected bonds of humanity that had transcended the brutal institution of slavery. "Thank you," she whispered, looking past Hattie to the dark waters of Lake Ontario that separated them from the United States. Somewhere far to the south, Elmwood Plantation continued under new ownership, the system of human bondage intact despite the exposure of the estate doctrine. But something had changed. A small crack had appeared in the edifice of slavery, created not by political maneuvering or economic arguments, but by the moral witness of those who had experienced its corrupting influence firsthand and refused to remain silent. "Our work is just beginning," Eleanor said quietly, tucking the portrait safely into her coat. "But tonight we celebrate your freedom." As they walked away from the waterfront toward the lights of Toronto, Eleanor thought of Isaiah, whose courage had purchased their escape at the cost of his life. His sacrifice and the testimony it had made possible formed part of the gathering storm that would eventually sweep away the institution that had claimed him. The Georgia Patriarch's estate doctrine had failed, not just in its immediate aims regarding his daughters, but in its underlying assumption that human dignity could be subordinated to property rights indefinitely. In its place stood a different doctrine, articulated by those who had fled and those who had helped them, a doctrine of inalienable humanity that no legal system or cultural tradition could ultimately deny.